The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Wait, Tylor, I know what that means now.
Yeah, no, you really don't.
My friends, together we're on a journey. We've gone through the glass columns, and now we're somewhere beyond. Welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Greg, the host who comes up with interesting introductions, and I am joined by Tylor, who is not that host. Tylor, how are you?
I'm doing very well. I think we're rapidly barreling towards who does the better introductions and me losing in a landslide on an online poll by like a 5-3 margin. But I think in general, I really liked these chapters. I had a lot of fun reading them. I'm enthusiastic about where we're at. Those two chapters, by the way, chapter 48, An Offer Refused, and chapter 49, Cold Rocks Hold. Couldn't remember if you had said that. But I do think that these two chapters kind of went against your prediction at the end of last week, right? You were ready for us to be in full-on epic climax. Everything is coming to a head in the way that we kind of did in the previous chapter. And while I had a really good time this week, this definitely wasn't that. So how did you feel kind of coming out of these two chapters of reading? I feel like you could either feel let down or like we're just kind of biding our time until something really big blows up. Where were you?
Yeah, I think I would describe these as cooling down my enthusiasm a little bit. And that's not to say they were bad chapters or that I didn't enjoy reading them, but I definitely felt like we had built some strong momentum, and this was a kind of pump the brakes moment, which, I think only makes sense that we might be at fever pitch in that new unexpected kind of plot line, but we aren't there yet. And it's not like we left Rand at a moment that really felt like, oh, this is, about to explode. And then I would say if I had a complaint, it might be that I'm not sure I personally felt too much different between these two chapters. It kind of felt like, all right, maybe because I'm in that mood. It's like, all right, let's just like update us on Aiel culture a little bit and let's just keep this moving. But we're not there yet in this plot line. And that's all right, because, we were maybe just talking about our upcoming weeks and we don't have very many of them left. So we'll get there, even if it's not this week.
I actually think that these chapters have one kind of thematic difference, and otherwise very much agree with you. I doubt you have last thoughts because you just took a big drink. So why don't we dive straight into a summary of chapter 48, An Offer Refused. Aviendha is walking while Rand is riding, and Aviendha is kind of chiding him for supposedly being interested in Isendre. Rand says that Aviendha is not soft. After that is the insult that she hurls at Isendre, and that kind of seems to give Aviendha some pause. Both Natail and Kiel seem to be arguing once again. This seems to be a regular thing, and Rand asks Aviendha to explain the concept of a roof mistress to him. We learned that in Aiel culture, men don't own their own property or land, and instead, when someone gets married, the bride is given a new roof or given one by one of their ancestors, and then they are the ones who own it and technically protect it, and they could theoretically deny their husbands access to anything that in the West would probably be considered their property. We also learned that Aviendha is very much upset at Rand, and that has not gone away at all. But Rand seems to be growing to enjoy Aviendha's company. She seems to be kind of the bright spot in some very boring days. And we also learn that Aviendha has now entered his dreams in the same way that Min and Elaine have. We then learn that they traveled for 12 days, and we learn about some of the plants and the weather and the snakes, and how all of those things can potentially kill you in the West. We learn that Moraine splits her time between the Wise Ones and Rand, and she warns Rand not to tie his own noose by creating a trap that he could fall into. We learn that Aviendha calls him stupid for angering Aes Sedai whenever he doesn't do exactly what Moraine suggests, and Egwene seems to be spending most of her time with Wise Ones, and eventually, more than halfway through their travel, she is able to remove the braids from her hair and once again basically act and dress like an adult. We learned that Aviendha, when she's asked about this, she says that Egwene has grown, and this seems to confuse Rand, especially when Aviendha refuses to talk about it any further. We learn that many of the other Aiel are still largely ignoring Rand, even though every day he trains not just with Lan, but also with Ruark. And at one point, Kader, the person who is running the peddler's wagon, he arrives and hints at having knowledge that he could potentially sell. But every time Rand kind of brings this up or tries to hint at what he might know, he either changes the subject or says that they might need to talk about it later. We also learned that Jason Natail kind of talks to him every morning, and at one point pulls him aside and asks about his feelings on his destiny. And Rand simply says that he is tired. Natail keeps kind of like pulling out more and more details from him as much as possible, but eventually Rand starts to kind of repeat the same phrases over and over again, and the Gleeman kind of gives up on him. Egwene, Moraine, and the Wise Ones, sometime during this trip, come to check up on his healing, and when they do, Moraine tells him that prophecy does not always mean what he expects, and so she might be able to help him interpret prophecy better. Rand says that he will do what he must, and Moraine actually seems satisfied by this answer, unlike many of the other answers that he has given. We also learn here that Jason Natail, the Gleeman, has been spending most of his nights in the Shido camp, and that the Gleeman seems to be afforded a significant amount of freedom by the Aiel, even though the Jindo are kind of upset with him not spending his nights in their camp. Rand wonders what Aviendha does with the Wise Ones at night, until one day he sees her channeling and realizes that she must be learning to channel. When she does this, Rand tries to channel in his surprise, but he is unable to do so as he can't grasp at the power. Mat seems to be avoiding Rand and denies knowing anything about what happened within the arch, but he also says that Rand should not go through the arch as it is much more dangerous than the one in Tyr. We also learn that Mat has been pursuing Isendre, and Kiel actually kind of interestingly offers Mat to let him have Isendre for money, which seems to kind of put Mat off the pursuit, at least briefly, but causes Isendre to threaten to kill Kiel, who simply responds that she who simply basically throws the threat back in her face, and Isendre immediately backs off very quickly. Eventually, Isendre even agrees that the price that Kiel has chosen is a good one for her. Kiel then turns on Rand and mentions that he is committed, perhaps to Aviendha or perhaps to another woman, and Rand says that Aviendha would kill him if she had the ability to, and Mat says that all of them are crazy, especially Rand for sticking around with Aviendha. But despite all of this, he keeps pursuing Isendre anyways. Then we kind of finish the apparently frame narrative, even though no one realized that's what it was, and Aviendha finishes explaining what roof mistresses are. Rand says that he doesn't fully understand, and she is angry with him, saying that he would like to make his wife subservient as it is in the West, and he says that she has it all wrong, but then Ruark arrives and says they've gotten to Cold Rock's hold. That was an impossible chapter to summarize because it's from Rand's point of view, and Rand does almost nothing in the chapter other than interact with other people who get the spotlight. What did you think here? Because it was an odd chapter that I don't know how much it moved the plot forward, but it got us through 12 days of travel relatively efficient.
Yeah, I mean, I felt that this was a kind of catch up chapter. Again, when somebody's reading this without the benefit of a podcast or a co-host who knows this really well and can kind of remember all this, I can see this being a really important moment to be like, okay, remember who's in this camp and how many different factions there are and how they're all relating to each other. And so I think, to me, the strength of it is just reminding us of these character relationships. And I think you said it right, not really shoving these forward dramatically, but edging them forward so that we understand which dynamics are still at play and which dynamics have shifted or have deepened in that little bit. So I found myself, I found the Rand Aviendha most compelling. Like, it feels a little bit like it's almost like a mentor mentee, but the mentee is kind of out of it and daydreaming a little bit. I don't know, Jon Snow and the character Ygritte, yes, Ygritte came to mind, right? You know nothing, Jon Snow, kind of that attitude of, okay, you're supposed to save us all, but you can't pay attention or remember these simple rules. So I thought that was the most compelling. And then in my notes, I was thinking, like, there are a lot of our friends who are kind of absent here, right? Egwene, Moraine, and Lan are all in this group, and we learn far more about like the Gleeman and the Tinkers and what they've been up to than we do what I would call the like A-level cast members, right? So if this is a television show, they got the week off, right? Last week must have been expensive to do the whole like striking of the tower, so they just had to do not a bottle episode, although I guess you could just put them in front of a green screen and pretend they're walking. But we reduced the cast member numbers so that we don't have to pay all the salaries this week.
That is 100% accurate. And so I think you're right to basically divide this chapter into two sections. There's the Rand and Aviendha section, and there is the side characters that we get reminded they exist and get a little nudge about how we should be thinking about them. You said you were really intrigued by Rand and Aviendha here. I guess I'm curious, what is your kind of I guess we haven't really settled on how we are describing their relationship, right? It is simultaneously like a friendship from one side, but a rivalry from the other, and we don't fully understand where Aviendha is coming from. What is your kind of read on where these characters are at and where you expect them to go going forward?
I think the best answer to your question is the question in my notes, which is Rand/Aviendha, arrow, funny or important? Because this really felt to me like it could just play as comic relief, right? Rand's supposed to be learning, he's barely paying attention and then doesn't learn the thing. And, I say this with much love to all my students, but you have that kid who zones out and immediately asks you the question that you just answered, and everybody in the class kind of turns and realizes it too. Those are some of my favorite moments because they're so funny, and I often don't have to answer the questions because somebody in the room is like, hey, he just said that while you were texting, usually. So it felt like it did play for laughs a little bit, but then I felt that the kind of stronger valence on the idea of learning Aiel culture had something greater to it. And I guess maybe how I'm interpreting that and some of the events that happened in the next chapter, but we'll be vague about those for the moment, is I think it's easy when you're reading this book and you know Rand's the main character and you know he's going to go do great, epic, big things to just be like, of course he is he who comes with the dawn. Of course he should be followed by everybody. But I thought that even in this dynamic, you're seeing that that's not really a sealed deal. Like, here's the Aiel he's perhaps closest to, although Ruark would probably make a claim at that. And he's really not winning her over, right? Like, she's not impressed. And while I don't think she'll challenge him, I get the vibes from her like, this is it. This is the Messiah they sent to help us. It doesn't really add up, is kind of my vibe check on it.
Yeah, no, and I think that's totally reasonable. So nope, the question I was about to ask you is very much a next chapter question. I guess the other interesting Rand and Aviendha moment that I want to highlight then is Rand realizing that Aviendha can channel, which I think both is really interesting in the sense of I wonder how that changes their dynamic. And I didn't pick up on any shifts, but it's got to change something. And then the other thing related to that is when that happens, Rand reaches for Saidin and is unable to connect. And so that to me raised some flags of like, where exactly is Rand at? Because he started this book doing like the most powerful thing we've seen him do with the power, but it seems like he's also not 100% capable of using it whenever he wants to.
Yeah, I think we already recently in my constantly thinking about Spider-Man for the last 8 weeks mentioned the kind of Spider-Man movie, the second Tobey Maguire one, where he kind of loses his Spidey powers. And it felt like that to me. It's like, because it's like a mental block, right? Because he's having his own kind of doubts and his lack of confidence, he's losing those abilities a little. I think that can sometimes be a little too on the nose when used as a device, and I'm not leveling that criticism here, but saying I'm a little wary of that type of device, but it seemed to be a part of it. I don't think of it as Aviendha or the witches are, they're not witches. Sorry, witches on the mind. But the wise ones. I don't think any of them are actively blocking him or like negating his power. I think it's more he's just so unsteady himself. And again, lacks confidence, because with all these questions are like, is he really the chosen one? And he wants to kind of fully step into that, but doesn't seem totally ready.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good read, right? We know that women seem to require possibly months or years of training, and Rand has gotten none of that. So I think it's right to kind of read him as still very much a novice in spite of his kind of obvious trajectory towards greatness. Um, if that's what we've got to say about Rand and Avienda, I think pretty much everything else is about the peddlers in this chapter, right? We've got Kader, who wants to sell some sort of secret to Rand. We've got the Gleeman Jason Natale, who is hanging out with the Shido at night and seems to want to find out all of the details of what Rand is thinking and feeling. We've got Isendre, who Matt is into and seems afraid of Kiel. And we've got Kiel, who yells at everyone, and it seems to work most of the time. What is your takeaway of which of these characters are important? Are you worried about them the way Rand seemed to be the last time we checked in with him? What's your take on these kind of new characters in the mix?
As I've confessed before, it takes me a while to warm up to new people. That's true in life and in books. And I just feel like that's where, hey, that face was not okay. I take that personally, even if the listeners can't see it. But like, I am finding myself having trouble caring about them. And where that comes in my mind is that any character that feels really temporary, I kind of put in that, like, see what our characters do in response to them, but don't really care about them.
Yeah.
And I think this chapter really suggests, and everything we've read in Robert Jordan is like, hey, if they seem like they're not that important and might disappear soon, they will, but they'll be back in 3 books or 2 books. And so I am starting to feel like these characters are getting the promotion. I mean, nothing will ever beat Elsie, who was like barely in it and then came back around. But it does feel like they're taking on a little more importance. And then, of course, to answer your question that I was dodging, where Rand expresses kind of suspicion of them, I think I naturally follow suit, right? And I'm sure listeners have mapped out that, like, first 5 clues, Greg's like, uh-oh, there's trouble, and I agree with the character. And then like the next 5, I'm like, nope, too many clues that's there. So we're still in the, like, I agree with the character. There's something else going on here. Obviously, the Gleeman is motivated. I mean, everybody hates a bard, right? So he's motivated. He's motivated to learn the story. But why with the Shido? That doesn't. I mean, I'm just saying the obvious clues here. And then the fact that they all seem to have a little bit more of an agenda going on. I guess the one I'm just jumping all over the place, but the one I'm not so interested in is Essendry, because this just seems like, you get a couple of attractive, are we still teenagers, late teenagers, early 20 somethings? And
Yeah, about
I mean,
that.
look no further than any of the college classes I've ever taught. You get a couple attractive kids in a room and they just start eyeing each other naturally, even if there's no prospect of a relationship there, right?
Yeah.
And so it felt like that with Avienda just totally overplaying it because of her loyalty to Elaine.
Yeah,
All
nice.
the E names. All the E names. Man.
I've started to give abbreviations to characters, and I'm running out of E abbreviations. Aviendha drove me crazy because I couldn't EG because that's Egwene. It's getting to be a problem. Uh, I honestly don't have too much else in this chapter. I wanted to just put like a little button on the fact that Aiel men can't own property, and that feels very much like Robert Jordan being like, "See, I can flip all the stereotypes." But other than that, not a whole lot stood out to me here. Last thoughts before we transition to chapter 49?
I do like that part, and it does remind me of early kind of female-centered comics, which were just like, yes, it's all comedically backwards, and we'll laugh at it, and we'll call this progress, right? And that doesn't work. The only thing I already complained that Egwene, Moraine, and Lan are just like they're the and the rest of the Gilligan Island theme
Yeah.
song this week, where it's like, yep, they're here somewhere, but it doesn't matter. So my only other note, and it was in your summary, but just to note, it seems dangerous that Matt is increasingly isolated.
Yeah.
I have trouble remembering his wish directly because it's been many, many weeks since he made that wish through the glass columns. Or nope, sorry, he was not. He was through the glass columns. He was in the
He was
archway,
not.
but no,
He was in the archway, but not through the columns.
yeah. So when he made that wish, I remember he said he just wanted nothing to do with the Aes Sedai and wanted to like no part of them. And I feel like we're starting to see that coming true in his isolation from Rand. But
Interesting.
maybe there's a more nuanced take to have on that.
I can say absolutely nothing about that. Chapter 49.
Okay.
Cold Rock's Hold. Rand is surprised because when he looks out on the vista, he doesn't see a village, but Ruark kind of starts running immediately towards a fissure in a rock wall. The Shido nearby start to make camp rather than continuing onward, and Rand notices that Moraine nearly joins him before eventually one of the Wise Ones convinces her not to. And at this point, Rand convinces Aviendha to ride with him rather than run alongside so that she can give him advice in the din. Aviendha threatens him if he makes her look like a fool, and he points out that the Wise Ones ride with Moraine, and so there shouldn't be anything odd about this. And she kind of gives him an odd look before saying he accepts change more easily than she does. At this point, Rand notices that Couladin is also running towards the fissure in the wall with them. Matt rides up alongside them and references what has happened and how this is different from things they've experienced in the past. And one of the things he says is an event that Rand and Matt never actually went through. It must be from one of his past lives. Rand explains to Matt that the peddlers with them are going to be coming to Al Dal, and Matt seems defeated that the peddlers will not be leaving sooner than later. Eventually, they ride into a canyon that was formed by that fissure in the rock wall, and all of them are shouting, and they are greeted by a large number of Aiel women who are also making large amounts of noise. Rand is awed by the green inside of this canyon and all of the animals, and Rand wonders at a number of fruits and vegetables that he doesn't recognize. It's tomatoes and corn. The men slow down, and Amis runs ahead, and we meet Leon, a woman who looks significantly older than Amis, but also looks fairly similar otherwise. Ruark asks his wife leave to enter, and she gives it and greets him warmly. Hairn, who heads another one of the clans, also asks and is formally granted access. At this point, Couladin approaches and asks, but he causes an uproar because he asks as if he was a clan chief. Aviendha says it could be violent if he is refused, and kind of gets mad at Rand for not realizing what a large offense this was. Aviendha doesn't understand basically anything about wetlanders, which causes Rand to be upset. But at this point, Leon kind of dismisses and gets rid of the problem by allowing for Couladin and the Shido to remain, but she gives him the answer as if he was a beggar, and then he leaves. And it's noted that he's clutching his forearms, trying to hold himself back from violence at this moment. And he starts staring at Rand. Rand then dismounts and asks leave to enter, but he does not ask as a chief. Instead, he just asks as a normal person, and Leon curtsies and welcomes him as the Caravan and tells him that being humble is a good thing. At this point, Matt and Rand are shocked when they learn that Leon, in addition to Amis, is Ruark's wife, and having two wives seems much to them. Ruark seems disapproving of Aviendha's teaching because Rand didn't know much, and Amis worries aloud that Aviendha may be teaching Rand wrong, including the fact that she accuses her of teaching her only things that the Maidens of the Spear would learn, including how to milk a garm, which we literally saw happen in the previous chapter. At this point, Rand steps in and says that he wants Aviendha to continue to be his teacher, and even as he does so, he's wondering to himself why he does it, but Amis eventually agrees after studying him briefly. They eventually get to Ruark's home, and Rand realizes that it is carved into the valley wall, and so it is much larger on the inside than it is on the outside, and he thinks of it as being ornate, but also informal. He and Matt both give ornate gifts for their arrival, and others and other than kind of looking askance at Land's sword, there doesn't seem to be any issue with all of the people who arrive, other than the fact that they refuse to take Moraine's gift, saying that the presence of an Aes Sedai is enough. Amis seems displeased when Moraine says that there will soon be more Aes Sedai in the waste, and a number of Guy Shane arrive and start preparing a meal. Amis and Leon, we learn, married the same man because they were close friends and didn't want to lose that friendship. And then Aviendha is kind of lecturing Rand and simultaneously getting more and more angry at him. Well, Rand says he doesn't know what he did, and she says he never did anything to her and never will. Aviendha is trying to teach him manners, but seems is so distracted by the fact that she doesn't get to participate in conversation. It's not exactly a very good lesson. Rand then asks for kind of a status update on who will join him and who will not. We learn that there are two clans already at El Dal and another nearly there. There will be 1,000 men per clan, which means eventually there will be 12,000 people. Some of these clans are rivals, but Ruark assures Rand that none of the other clans are Shido, and so none of them will break the peace. We learned that it will be less than a month until all of the Aiel arrive, and Rand is worried that not all of them will join him, and it will cause conflict among the group that he really thought he would be able to count on. At this point, Moraine jumps in suddenly and asks where he means to lead the Spears to war. All of the Aiel don't seem surprised by this. Instead, they seem ready, and Rand leaves immediately. Both Egwene and Aviendha almost follow, but don't. Once again, way too much summary. Say things about this chapter.
Well, I will say of the two chapters, this is the one I probably struggled with a bit more. I will admit in my notes, I don't bother to take a full summary because I know Tylor will obviously cover it in great detail. Listeners can tell he puts all the work in. I just show up and answer his questions. So I wrote in mine, lots of Aiel politics, parentheses Rand, which just means that it was Rand's point of view chapter. And so I would say that's kind of what I saw here, is that we were supposed to be learning a lot more about Aiel culture. Now for stupid things. Number one, I enjoyed reading this shortly after seeing the film Furiosa, because this location sounds like where Furiosa is from, for other people who saw that. And second, I know there's at least one listener, who has followed me across the internet to my guest appearance on the Wampa's Lair this week, where I talked about the mythology of the Phantom Menace. And about halfway through that episode, when we were talking about Queen Amidala, I talked about the moment she bowed before Boss Nass and revealed who she was and like showed her humility. Tylor's nodding as if he's seen Phantom Menace sometime in the last 25 years, but I don't believe that's true.
It today. I started rewatching the series in chronological order.
Hey, all right. So I paused like halfway through a sentence on that podcast, and I was like, man, I'm talking about the exact same thing on Through the Glass Columns. So if somebody has followed me and time traveled, that is the moment where, because I do think it's kind of a similar moment, and this is, I'm just going to complete the trifecta and say, to me, what always comes to mind is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where the first test to get the Holy Grail is penitent man will pass, and Indiana Jones goes penitent, penitent man is humble, kneels before God, kneels and dives below a saw blade that would have cut his head off. This is just classic cinema. So that to me is what is being drawn upon here, this kind of tradition of Western mythology that is about being humble, being penitent. And there are many simpler ways to say that. I could have just said good leaders are humble, but no, I walked you through 3 different movies to get to that relatively simple point.
I would 100% start a second podcast with you where at the beginning of the episode, I just name a movie that you know well, and then you describe the entire movie shot for shot. I would pay money to have you do that podcast with me. I think that's exactly right. I really like the method that Robert Jordan uses here of not telling us what the actual cultural norm is, but instead just letting us walk through the same ceremony 4 times in a row and kind of piece together what are the things that Couladin is saying that Rand isn't, why is what he's doing clever. And I think there's a very interesting moment where it's not 100% clear whether Rand intentionally doesn't say what Couladin did, or whether he forgets and then kind of takes advantage of it, which might suggest that it was more of a ta'veren. That's the word I was looking for. Yeah, more of a ta'veren thing.
Yes. Let's not count that as me correcting Tylor, but I knew it. I knew it because I was going to respond and say I read that totally as a ta'veren moment, right? And I think that makes sense when you kind of lose your conscious thought that it's the power of the ta'veren kind of pushes you in the right direction. And I thought that worked well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to some degree, this is a scene that does a really good job of contrasting Rand against Couladin, right? Because they both have exactly the same choices and go the opposite direction. And I think what we're learning is that Rand is very much in that kind of uniter archetype, right? It feels like when you get these big messiah figures, either they are people who have to destroy all in their way, or they want to kind of be bringing people together. And it feels like Couladin and Rand are at this point kind of the polar opposites in that respect. And it seems like it's time for Rand to need to win over people to him rather than Couladin, or else things can kind of spiral very quickly. I guess what I'm saying is like, yay, exciting things are on the horizon. What other notes did you have from the early section of this chapter? Because I feel like it could very much be just like the reminder of Aiel culture, but there's also a lot of really just fun moments that I like. Like, I always really enjoy when, for example, there are conical yellow vegetables and round red fruits that Rand has never seen, and I have to figure out what they are. And I think it's later on in the chapter it becomes obvious that they're corn and tomato from the names that the Aiel give them. But like those kind of details really flesh out the world in a way that I like. Was there anything that really stood out to you as like putting the Aiel kind of culturally that you got them better after a moment or an example?
I like the vegetable moment, and it reminds me again, as a giant Star Wars fan, Star Wars always has to make this choice of like what concepts can just come into that universe. So
Yep.
recently on an episode of a Star Wars TV show, a character said, I just had to earn a paycheck. And one of the critics I listened to, who's really great, kind of went off on a rant about how there should not be paychecks in the Star Wars universe and went through
Yeah.
like the economic history of where checks came from. And like, I get that that's fun and nitpicky, but like there's no good line for any of these universes. Now, Wheel of Time gets to play the cards differently since it is our culture kind of advanced far, far into the future. But it's like anywhere you dig deep enough on any word is going to lead you to some earthly kind of definition of it.
The version of this that always makes me laugh is anytime in fantasy stories that they try to use like the Latin origin of a word as like part of their like magic puzzle. And I'm like, there's no Latin. There were no Romans in this history. You don't get to go back into our world's etymology and pick something out of it. That's not how this works. So yeah, I think we're identifying exactly the same thing. I also find it really fun that all of the examples of things that Rand had not been exposed to are all plants that I believe are native to the Americas. And so there's kind of like a real world corollary to someone who is used to farming more or less like Western European crops not having been exposed to the crops from the other half of the world, and it kind of lines up really well with the actual crops at play here. If we're talking about all of the fun Aiel moments, I think we also need to just highlight the fact that Matt tags along just because he didn't want to be left behind, and then immediately like Matt's all over everything, right? He just starts asking questions and inserting himself into all of the moments. I just thought this was a fun Matt in the background. I could see this being an SNL sketch, right? Like Rand is negotiating in the foreground, and Matt is just fucking. I should not say that on our podcast. That's our one for today. He messes shit up. I just did it again. It's an explicit podcast this week. I'm so sorry.
Tyler made an edit point and I didn't. Oh, I hope you can put in a bleep instead of anything, instead of editing it out. Yes, I do think that those moments are played nicely for comedy, right? And there is, I do mostly play the game of like, well, why is Matt making this choice, and which part of Matt is making this choice? But mostly in those moments, I'm laughing and being like, yeah, he really just is kind of the bumbling fool. And again, on that episode of Wampa's Lair, we were talking about archetypes and how characters fall into like a mythological archetype. And Matt is a really interesting one because some of these scenes would fit in with like the jester archetype or the like wise fool archetype. But because of who he is, it always feels like he's more of the rogue, the gambler in particular, since he got his luck powers. And so it's more like I think it feels, to put it in D&D terms, it feels more like chaotic neutral than it does anything else, right? He's just kind of acting chaotically and it just leads to comedy.
I think Matt highlights for me that the borderline between Han Solo and Jar Jar Binks is a lot finer of a line than we think. And Matt is currently straddling the line between those two characters, I think is kind of where I'm at. The related moment to this is Matt and Rand freaking out about the fact that Ruark has two wives. They seem very interested and very upset about this fact. And I just need to both give Robert Jordan credit for having polyamory this early, and also chide Robert Jordan for always, like every other fantasy author, introducing polyamory as one man in every single.
Yes, and it was, while they were comedic moments, I just watched a terribly dated episode of a sitcom. I'm not even gonna out which sitcom it was. It was like a 40-something-year-old man who was a doctor encountering his first lesbian couple and like not being able to like string together a sentence because he's so engrossed in the fantasy of these two beautiful women making out with each other. And it was so gross and terrible. And yet from the like late 2000s, like just maybe even past 2010, I was like, this is terrible, especially like a doctor. It's not like somebody who wouldn't encounter people all the time. So it was, I similarly want to give credit that polyamory is played here as natural and healthy, because I think the other place it goes to is like, yes, they all pretend this is what they want, but then the wives are secretly jealous of each other or they hate this and that. And I thought it was played as like, no, this is different than our society, but it can work and it's a perfectly acceptable arrangement. That being said, I also recently saw the movie Challengers, which just is all about polyamory and just great time at the movies. People should see it, but it's like wonderfully trashy in some ways. And I was like, I want to bring those vibes to Wheel of Time as well.
So just Game of Thrones vibes. That's what we're going for here, basically. The only other thing related to this is the two women in this pair, Leon and I don't know whether it's Amis or Amis. I think I switched between the two. They are described early on in the chapter as looking very different in age. One of them, I believe it is Leon, looks substantially older than Amis. But later on in the chapter, we learn that they are very likely extremely close in age. They got married to Ruark together because they were such close friends for all of their life that they decided they didn't want to split up that friendship and kept it going into the marriage. So that suggests that this may be one of our first book examples of channelers looking very different than non-channelers in terms of how they age, right? We've gotten hints at this with Moraine. We've gotten hints at this with Varen, and then with Suan and um, Liana, both when they were still looking younger. But this, I think, is one of our first side-by-side examples of two characters, presumably within a year or two of each other in age, looking very different because one of them can channel and the other cannot.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody about that last week, and it was either you or I had a really weird conversation somewhere else. But I think it was you. So we won't add too much to that. But I think it is worth noting, exactly as you said, another book hint, because we feel a little more clear on those rules due to the television show, but we'll keep it vague.
Absolutely. We then arrive at the interior of this area. We get a meal. We get a really detailed description of the living situation and the furniture and the ornate everything. And then, honestly, unless you want to talk about how mad Aviendha is, I'm pretty sure the next thing we've got is an update on the status of the Aiel, and it's very much not what Rand wanted to hear. Right, only 2 of the 12 clans are already in place. The ones that aren't there could take 3 or 4 weeks to arrive, and we also learned that there is not a lot of confidence that all of them will side with Rand. I think the way that Ruark describes it is most will come simply because you have the 2 dragons, but that's not going to be enough for everyone, and it's not clear whether all of the Aiel will immediately side with him, especially since it's unclear what the Shido will do, as they're not going to be led by Couladin, we learn. They will instead be led by a woman who is taking over until a new clan chief can be appointed. Savannah, I believe, is her name.
Yes, and I guess that is the point some of that. I'm not going to take credit for all of that. Some of that is what I was referencing last chapter when I said, like, it's very clear by the end of this that this is not a done deal. Even though we believe he's the chosen one, even though he's marked with the mythological dragons, it's going to be a hard sell. And, I read that and I just thought we had to create some stakes for the last part of this plot line, right? The last part of this book's plot line. And so, if it felt like he was just waiting for everybody to show up, check a box, and then they run off to go make war, that wouldn't feel good. I feel like this is building to like a Braveheart or, Aragorn speech where he'll have to really win over the crowd and rally them to his side. And I like that type of moment in movies or books. So I'm here for it, and I'm excited and glad we can have some stakes to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes sense. Jumping back just a little bit, I do have something I want to say briefly about Aviendha and Rand. There's a really interesting moment where Rand kind of very directly asks Aviendha, "What did I do to you to make you so angry?" And her response, I think, is very interesting and maybe our best hint so far at why Aviendha seems so frustrated with Rand. She says, "You have done nothing to me, and you never will." And this makes me, one, wonder what it is she is worried about him doing. And two, makes me want to once again remind everyone that she has recently gone through a ter'angreal that lets her see alternate versions of her future. So I'm wondering what she saw in that ter'angreal that she is worried that Rand could do. Any thoughts on that? Just because it feels like our most concrete, even if it's very vague, the best we've gotten from Aviendha so far.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it 100 and say that I am not tracking her. I am not reading her as angry as you are, which I think is a combination of my poor reading, but also like there's something coming. I could tell that, and I'm not saying you're not poker faced or anything like that. And I think it's good that you're reminding us of this anger existing, because it often feels like more annoyance than like deep anger. So so my honest reaction is just like okay, I would not be clocking any of what you just said if I weren't here with you. And so I'm glad I'm here with you. And I think it's good to give us that reminder that it may be that she's just mad about something that could happen, not something that's actually happened.
Yeah.
I still go back to, I think my mind just defaults to like she wants him to behave a certain way because he's committed to Elaine and doesn't want that dynamic messed up in any way, kind of like what we talked about with the Sentry. So I'm interested to see where this goes based on all that.
Excellent. I have one last thought on this chapter, and it is Moraine's non sequitur at the end of this chapter, right? More or less out of nowhere, she quotes prophecy back at him. This is, I think, something that he had said to her earlier in the book. She responds, "Where will you lead the spears to war?" And this is interesting, one, because why did she pick then to ask the question? Two, because the Aiel react almost positively, not negatively, to the idea of being used in that way. And then three, Rand refuses to answer, which is very different from the way that he's kind of interacted with Moraine in the past, where he usually kind of deflects, but at least gives in a bit. What was your take on this kind of final moment in the chapter? Which of those kind of aspects stood out most to you?
I'm gonna sneak in just something from my notes that hasn't gotten much attention until now, which is this moment where they are gonna pull Aviendha away from Rand, and Rand kind of answers like, "No, I'd like to keep her around," and it is his reaction. I'm not gonna remember the exact words, but it's almost like he wasn't in control of that decision, which feels to Viren or Old Blood again, some force kind of making sure they stay together. So then to jump to the question that was asked, I think it is feeling like we're noting a power shift between Rand and these other characters, particularly Moraine. And I'm not entirely sure he's in control of that response, right? In other words, I'm not sure he's saying, I want to be more harsh with Moraine than I ever have been before. I think it's much more kind of, there are larger forces moving these pieces around, and that kind of strong rebuke helps advance that or pushes someone one way or the other. So that's a non-answer, but it's kind of where I felt, where it was like, Rand seems to be, and I'm going to say out of control, but not meaning it as somebody who's like, tearing down posters in a wall, a dorm room or something. I don't know why that's my definition of out of control. Some bad roommate memories, man. I guess. But it just feels like somebody who is not in control of their choices and that could be a function of just being overwhelmed by all these forces at play, or it could be something else.
And we'll find out which it is. I was about to say exactly the same thing. Yeah, these I think were a couple of really fun chapters because they get me wondering what comes next. And that's a little bit less fun than seeing what comes next, but it can be really great when it sets things up effectively. And I trust Robert Jordan to do that. We have two chapters coming up next week. That is chapter 50, Traps, and chapter 51, Revelations in Tanchico. And unexpectedly, Greg, we actually only have 5 weeks left after today. We slightly reshuffled our reading order. So yes, that did change compared to what you expected if you've been following along with us. There's one more episode. We're really close to the end of this book. Greg, what are you anticipating and excited about? And then, say the name of your podcast.
Well, I definitely will take credit for Tylor being like, we could have a slightly longer week and cut it down to 5. And I said yes before the question left his mouth because I want to just keep reading this book. I am, I've talked before, I measure my reading each year. It's just something I do for fun. And yet I get competitive with myself. And one of the things that makes that difficult is slowly reading like 1,000-page book so that I don't get to put this in my tallies. And I was desperately hoping we would finish it before the end of June to be in my first half of the year. So we're not going to. So, but we will eventually get there sometime through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.